I think there's a particular reason why people haven't come to consensus on what emergence is.
Hey, the way that you've been thinking about a phenomenon is problematic for all of these armchair reasons that I haven't done any work in the lab, which I have since, but at that point, I haven't done any work in the lab. I've been sitting in a chair, and I'm telling you that something in your research is wrong.
I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but I don't find humans very interesting. Right?
Well, it's been nice talking to you guys, and we will...
Yeah, I mean, if my wife is going to listen to this, I'm in real trouble. But you see what I mean?
What are we doing? Like, this is all so confused and terrible.
This is Brain Inspired.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Middlebrooks. Welcome to Brain Inspired. You just heard two philosophers, Paul Humphreys and Zach Irving, both at the University of Virginia. I just realized that those little snippets at the beginning there may make them sound like pessimistic or angry philosophers, but it is quite the opposite. You'll hear that they are both fine young men and a pleasure to chat with. Paul has been philosophizing for quite some time now. He's written extensively on multiple topics in philosophy and the philosophy of science. I mean, he's written entire books on emergence and on computational science, and he's the editor and a contributor to the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Science. Those are just a few samples of his works. And recently, he has gotten interested in the philosophical issues related to artificial intelligence. Zach is in the beginnings of his career, but he has dug deep into the philosophy and neuroscience of spontaneous thought, and in particular, the burgeoning study of mind wandering. So today, in the first part of the show, we focus mainly on the science and philosophy of emergence and of mind wandering, touching on lots of fun topics like consciousness, mindful meditation, the place of emergence and or mind wandering in AI systems, and so on. And later in the show, we talk more broadly about how philosophy fits among neuroscience and AI, and how Paul and Zach view the current relationship between philosophy and science. Sorry for spoiling the ending here, but the conclusion? We should all be friends and try to understand each other better. I like that. So I really enjoyed our discussion today, and I hope that you do as well. In the show notes, I link to both Paul and Zach's websites, plus some of the papers and books that we talk about on the show. And that is all, of course, at braininspired.co/podcast/29. Want to say thanks today to Kamal, David, Bas, Mario, Estevayo, and Tobias, all for supporting the show on Patreon. You too can do that through the website at braininspired.co. And I added a way a couple days ago to do it through PayPal as well, if that's a better option for you. Although the PayPal button looks terrible on the website, but it'll do for now. Anyway, I continue to feel super grateful and amazed that you guys value the show enough to contribute to it. Thank you. Many of you now have reached out to me to request guests and suggest topics. I love hearing from you guys and hearing where you are in your journey, so keep that up. I have some guests lined up to address some of your requests, so you can look forward to that. And feel free to contact me at paul@braininspired.co with suggestions for guests and or topics. For now, please enjoy the philosophical and personal stylings of Paul Humphreys and Zach Irving. All right. I have Paul Humphreys and Zach Irving today. Great to have you guys on the show. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
So to maximize the time that we have, this can be a little bit different. I'm going to do most of the introduction for you. I will have done most of the introductions of both of you guys beforehand here because we have a lot to get to, it turns out.
Yeah.
Now, this is the second time that I've had two people on the show. I recently had Ioana Marinescu and Conrad Kurding on the show, and it turned out I was able to help them through some tough marital issues, and hopefully I can create that magic again today here. So how long have you guys been married?
Not long enough.
Oh, good.
Marriage is exactly 1 year, almost 1 year and 2 months. So.
Oh, good. Maybe the newlywed game today will go well then. So, so what I do want to ask about, you guys are both involved in this group, the Human and Machine Intelligence Group at the University of Virginia. And Paul, you're a co-director of this group, and Zach, you're a faculty member. And you want to just tell me, how did this group come about, and what do you guys do in the group?
Well, like most things, it came about because some money became available, and once we got going, I mean, it really took off. I mean, UVA is a place where talking to people in other departments is not as easy as it is in some other places. And so, we've got people from philosophy, from computer science, from sociology, from architecture, from the law school. I mean, pretty much you name it. There's people participating in this from a number of different perspectives, which has really been interesting. And I've really been heartened by how philosophy can engage with these different areas.
And does everyone, on a rainy day, still make it to the meetings from so many different areas?
Well, we provide food. So
maybe I'll come.
Soup house.
Yes.
So what do you guys talk about? And what do you guys do during the meetings and as a group?
Yeah, so we've, a lot of the discussions have been, there have been talks where we engage in general discussions. And there have also been some sort of breakout working groups that have focused one group on representation and the other group on sort of ethical and sort of normative issues to do with AI. I think would be a sort of breakdown of how the groups work.
Yeah, so it naturally split into those two groups. And as Zach said, most weeks we have a presentation from someone who specializes in an area. Yeah. We've occasionally tried to have discussions. For example, this semester, we had people read the European Union ethics proposals.
Oh, wow.
I thought that was really going to engage people. It turned out that I guess people in computer science either don't want to talk about this or, discussion isn't really something that they want or are willing to do, which I was disappointed in. But, because we're philosophers, that's our game.
Right. To be disappointed. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a cool group. So. Okay, so as always, we have a lot to discuss today, so it'll be a miracle if we get to it all, but we're going to definitely try here. So much of what we're going to discuss is a role where philosophy, I think, thrives and can really help sort out, what the hell it is that we're actually trying to study in neuroscience and in artificial intelligence. But, it's also where some people become disillusioned, I'd say, with philosophy. So I hope part of what comes out of this conversation today is just, how and where philosophy fits alongside neuroscience and AI. That being said, let's start out just getting frustrated here, okay? So I had Melanie Mitchell was on the show a few weeks ago, and she's an expert in complexity science and artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And complexity as a concept is hard to pin down. It turns out it's difficult to define. There's not a single definition or a grand theory of complexity, but there are common features to complex systems. And one of those features of a complex system is emergence. And it turns out emergence as a concept is hard to pin down and hard to define. But it, too, has sort of a cluster of common characteristics. So, Paul, you've written a lot about emergence, and your most recent book is called Emergence, A Philosophical Account. So, what is emergence, and why is it not easily defined? And I should say, you both feel free to jump in and chime in whenever you have something to add as well.
Yeah. No, I like that analogy with definitions of complexity a lot, because as people know, that there's an entire zoo of different definitions of computational complexity out there, and each of them have motivations that you can justify, but it's hard to bring them all under one umbrella. And the same thing with emergence, and I think there's a particular reason why people haven't come to consensus on what emergence is. The way I'd like to put it is that, if you contrast it with causation, everybody will agree that certain core cases are cases of emergence, right? So you have a rock hitting a window. For causation. So you have a rock hitting a window. If you don't agree that there's a causal sequence going on there, you need to leave the room and not continue the discussion. But there aren't core examples with emergence. I mean, different people, coming from different areas, computation or biology or physics or philosophy, see different things as examples of emergence. And not everybody agrees that they are actually examples. So that's how you get different definitions of emergence, well, coming out, say, and
emerging. Just go ahead and say it. Emerging. Yeah.
It's hard to avoid that. Yeah.
Actually, one of the things you were reminding me of, I saw this really nice talk by Jim Woodward on sort of folk theories of causation last year, and the sort of lesson that I got from that talk. I don't know if this is the lesson that Jim wanted to have from the talk, but this was my reading of Jim. Was that one of the reasons why we get this sort of these more unified conceptions of causation are because humans evolved to track causes. When you were apes 300,000 years ago that could track causal relations, did a whole lot better at manipulating those causal relations and being able to effectively control their environment than apes who couldn't. And as such, we have so we can use those sort of folk concepts of causation that have evolved biologically and that also have evolved in culture as a sort of like grounds for starting to refine our philosophical notions. Whereas I'm not sure that that's the case with abstract philosophical concepts like emergence or complexity.
Because emergence is undoubtedly weird, and you don't run across uncontroversial cases of it in ordinary life. That one of the great things that science has done is that in many cases that initially seem emergent, you can formulate a reductive theory and explain it, and it goes away. So we're not acquainted with these things. But to say something positive about this and address the other part of your question, I mean, I find a sixfold taxonomy of emergence useful. And there's a broad division between what's called synchronic accounts of emergence, where the emergent phenomenon occurs at the same time as the things from which it emerges.
Right.
And then there's diachronic emergence, in which the emergent phenomenon occurs later than the things from which it emerges. Now, in philosophy, the synchronic tradition has been dominant for a very long time. And so when people talk about consciousness, they tend to think of people's conscious experiences as occurring at exactly the same time as whatever the brain processes are that give rise to it. But over the development of the universe, there are interesting cases. For example, between the Big Bang and now, you have molecules appearing that weren't there close to the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's an important question as to whether it's legitimate to say that those molecules actually emerged from earlier states of the universe. So that's an area in which diachronic emergence seems to be something that you need to pay attention to. So that broad division, synchronic and diachronic, is one dimension. The other dimension has three. There's ontological emergence, which claims that there are out there in the world genuine examples of emergence. They're not a product of our theory or conceptual framework. The second position, which we can call epistemological emergence, is that some things, maybe in the area of computation, are sufficiently complex that we can't predict them in the way that you can predict things like eclipses of the sun.
So, but just to hold there for a second. So ontology is the study of being, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
When thinking about ontological emergence versus epistemological emergence, in ontological emergence, the emergence is real outside of even our conception of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
in epistemological emergence, it is essentially that we don't have as humans, we don't have the tools to reduce it to its origins, right?
That's right.
How would we be able to tell the difference between an epistemic and an ontological emergence, right? Would we, since by definition we don't have the tools as humans to tell whether it's ontologically emergent or whether we just don't have the tools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so assessing cases of ontological emergence is much harder than assessing epistemological emergence. So, I mean, let's go back to the complexity issue. I mean, you can know that in principle, a certain state of a system is predictable from your basic theory.
Mm.
But for computational reasons, for example,
I see.
It could be so complex that you can't do it in practice. And so, you've got there something that's epistemologically emergent, but not ontologically emergent.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry for the stoppage there. So
I wonder also whether so in cases of ontological or when you're trying to decide, is this emergence just merely epistemic or is it ontological? I think that's where arguments like Jaegwon Kim's sort of top-down causation problems come in, where you have these sort of general problems with ontological emergence, where you'd sort of worry that they violate sort of basic principles of causation, like the causal closure of the physical, which would make you think that the cases where purport to be ontological emergence might just be epistemic, because that creates a lot fewer problems elsewhere for ontology.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be a default reason, at least in cases of synchronic emergence, I would think, to think that the cases that we're finding empirically are epistemic and not ontological, unless we have really, really good reasons to believe otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. And so the third category is conceptual emergence, where in order to recover effective predictability, you have to develop a new representational framework.
Okay.
And then, if you're fortunate, then you can go back to predicting things. So that's a taxonomy that I find useful. If you ran into a random philosopher, they'd almost certainly disagree with this. But, as a working hypothesis, I think it's pretty good.
Well, I think that's super helpful. I had Dean Buonamano on the show, and he's a neuroscientist, and he studies the neuroscience of time, which, we really still don't understand how time gets encoded and represented in brains at the mesoscale, let's say. But one of the things that he has done, and others have done as well, that I think is just a great start, is built a taxonomy, and how important that is to set the foundation for creating a science and then going and studying the actual phenomenon. So I think it's a great foundation from which to build, and then we can always argue about whether that foundation is right and how to
that's right.
continue. But so before we move on, let's just talk about some of the common properties really quick that encompass emergence, right? So I know one is that an emergent phenomenon, it needs to be novel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And there needs to be some holistic aspect to it. I don't know if you want to maybe comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think novelty is the one thing that pretty much everybody agrees on, that an emergent property has to have. Historically, holism has been very important. But think back to the distinction between diachronic and synchronic accounts. I mean, holism plays a central role usually in synchronic accounts, but it's far less obvious that you need that with synchronic accounts, just because the considerations are different. I mean, the novelty is going to come out of the previous states of the system, but they could be non-holistic and just significantly different. I could give you an example later on if you like. But so yeah, novelty is there. Holism is fine for synchronic, maybe not so fine for diachronic.
Right. Okay. Well, okay. And another property is that it should be somewhat autonomous from its origins, right? I think that's kind of embedded in the first two somewhat.
Yeah. Can we introduce the elephant in the room of consciousness right now?
Yeah. No. Okay. Well, yeah, let's just go ahead because I was going to ask about consciousness because the first time that I heard the term emergence, it was in respect to consciousness because this is the way that just commonly it's thought of that as a way of explaining how our mind emerges from our brain processes is emergence. That's what emergence is. But there's a lot of other aspects a lot of other ways in which emergence occurs. But yes, let's talk about consciousness for a moment.
I was going to ask Zach if he thinks that consciousness satisfies the autonomy.
Satisfies the autonomy
condition.
So what do you need for an autonomy condition?
Well, usually it's that the autonomous, the emergent property has to be dependent in some way on the thing from which it emerges, but it has to operate in whatever way you interpret that in a sense that is independent from the
base. And so that sounds like it's going to fit best with causal emergence, where you're saying that it's getting novel causal properties.
Yeah.
Right. I think that there are really, really deep problems that arise if that Jae-Kwon Kim brought up in the 90s and Jessica Wilson that arise if you think that there's genuinely new causal properties being had by conscious experience. I could draw you a picture of what the problem is.
Okay,
it's not going to come out in the podcast. But
you draw it to me and then send it to me, and I'll use it as the cover art.
Right. So here's the actually there's a bunch of different steps in the argument, but the sort of basic idea is that look, if consciousness is going to sort of emerge from the basal properties, right? So like say consciousness emerges from what's going on in the brain.
Yep.
Yeah, and indeed is at some point going to emerge from what's going on in the microphysical properties of the brain, right? So like the atoms.
Sure. All the way down. Reduce it all the way down. Yeah.
Here's a really plausible general claim about physics. That microphysical level is closed, right? Where so you have one conscious state, say an intention to go get an ice cream that's being caused by another conscious state, say your desire for an ice cream, right? Both of those are gonna supervene on microphysical states. But those microphysical states, the sort of the intention to go get an ice cream, that's going to be caused exhaustively by the earlier microphysical states. So if you're going to introduce and say that the conscious states have new causal powers, that they're autonomous in this sort of strong ontological sense, then the worry is that you're either going to get causal overdetermination, or you're going to violate where there's the microphysical properties actually two causes from the consciousness and from the basal cause, or you're going to get the not causal closure of the microphysical, and that's really problematic. So and then Jae-Kwon Kim runs through these options and says they're all big problems. And I think that these really are deep ontological problems that if you believe in ontological emergence, it's hard to see how you would get around these problems.
So I love this, first of all, because whenever I've asked the vast majority of people, neuroscientists, when I start to bring up consciousness, so they start to get itchy, and roll their eyes.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, me too.
I agree. So could I just make my own position on the status of consciousness clear? I think when one is discussing emergence, you should stay away from consciousness. It might be emergent, seems like a plausible candidate, but we don't know anywhere near enough to say it is or it isn't, where there are clear examples lower down the scale in physics, chemistry, biology, where you've got much better reasons for thinking that certain kinds of phenomena are emergent. Now, again, I'm not sure that everybody would agree with that.
I disagree with you on the details. I think I'm sort of in general agreement that I'm a little bit worried about the sort of general discussions of consciousness, but I do think that there's certain cases of conscious experiences where maybe we have or at least starting to get a sort of better worked out conception of how emergence might work. So the case that we've talked about that I really like is flavor experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really cool cases where so you have this when you taste the balance of a wine, that's a property that matters in wine, and that affects how we aesthetically evaluate it, how much it sells for. One of the centrally important properties of wine. I think that something like diachronic emergence might actually, so that flavor of balance in wine is coming from the sort of taste percept and the smell percept and even vision potentially, and audition and touch. This is a massively multimodal experience. Is this flavor percept?
Mm-hmm.
That I think there are psychologists and the neuroscientists who work on flavor have argued that it's emerges from the sort of the single modalities. And I think that this is one case where you might actually get a much nicer picture of how sort of a conscious experience can emerge from another experience. And I think it's a picture that might be diachronic emergence, where you have these sort of individual percepts, right? Like the tastes and the smells and stuff. And you can focus on those. And then all of a sudden, instead of focusing on those, you focus on this sort of emergent flavor percept. And then you can't focus on the individual. So like if you're gonna think about the balance in a wine, you really don't want to be thinking about the individual tastes, because that will just totally destroy the balance. You just can't report on the aesthetic properties well if you're focusing on the individual tastes.
So for it to be diachronic, though, what you're essentially saying is that these processes need to build up over time, right? These different modalities need to interact over time to then give rise to a later emergent state of wine bliss or what have you.
Yeah, well, so the reason why I haven't worked this out, but I think might be one case where if I'm going to say that there's some emergence is going to do something like ontological emergence, is going to do some real work in the neuroscience, this would be a case.
Mm-hmm.
Where what I would think is that you can either experience the sort of individual percepts, so the taste and the smell and focus on those, or you can experience the balance, and you sort of might oscillate back and forth between these two. And when you start feeling the balance, you just don't experience the individual percepts. You just can't focus on them.
Right.
In the same way. And then when you focus on the individual percepts, you just literally can't report on the balance. And I mean, the wine tasters can't. I think there's empirical evidence that when you're telling me, are there blackberries in the wine, you can do that. But at that moment, if you ask, is the wine good? Say, I have no idea if the wine's any good, because I'm not experiencing these sort of general flavor properties. So I think that's a case. There might be, when we look at the sort of more details of neuroscience.
Yeah, that's a nice case, but you see exactly what that's got. I mean, that's got a lot of empirically well confirmed detail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the really nice thing about research on emergence in the last couple of decades is that it, in some areas anyway, it's got away from this air of mystery that used to surround it, and is something that was one of the reasons why interest in emergence really sort of fell off the edge of a cliff at one time. But that's what you want, some really good informed evidence for a particular result.
And notice also the other disanalogy between that case and the sort of consciousness debate is what I wasn't trying to tell you is how consciousness emerges from the physical.
Mm-hmm.
Like that sort of explanations in flavor perception give you nothing of that. What I was trying to tell you is how one conscious experience can emerge from another conscious experience.
Right.
And I think those are sort of tractable empirical questions where the sort of philosophical models might really help. But things get messy when you start talking about the mind-body problem.
Yeah. Well, this is one. Okay, so there's a lot to chew on here. One aspect is that isn't it great that the idea of consciousness and emergence being an emergent phenomenon actually popularized the idea of emergence, which now we can take back, and say, okay, let's look at it in these grounded, empirically well-studied examples to figure out what emergence is, because then you have consciousness, which is also a mystery, right? So it doesn't make much sense to study one mystery with another. But consciousness has also enjoyed a period now where there are attempts to study consciousness, grounding it in these other empirical known facts and well-studied situations as well. So it'll be nice when these guys, can both join back up, less of a mystery, right? Emergence and consciousness, although there's still a lot to be had within their joining right now, I suppose. But so why has emergence historically and is still just associated so much with consciousness? Why can't people be happy with studying emergence on these infinite other processes that could be emergent?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, I have to be careful here because I know that a lot of your audience is in neuroscience and so forth.
Be very careful.
But I really do think it's just because we don't properly understand consciousness. And there are standard histories that say if you look at the historical development emergence in the 1920s and around there, life was one of their core examples. Mm-hmm. And then, we come on and then we get to the development of molecular biology. And now people really start understanding what the processes behind living organisms are. And that's when that example slips away from you.
Well, except organism-centered biology now, right, that does actually view organisms like that there are people in organism-centered biology that do want to make the claim that organisms are so strongly emergent from their molecular processes, and you can't understand biology by just talking about them.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, now we're
going back.
I mean, here's the history, right? So in the 19th century, life was a prime example. It went on through the 1920s, and then you get up to 1953, and then after that, it starts dissolving. But now, right? I mean, biologists are back with some really interesting examples, but that's because we understand, how, proteins interact to get metabolism. And metabolism seems to be a candidate for an emergent feature. So, these things go up and down, but the thing that drives them is you either find a reductive model that works and then the emergence goes away,
right,
or you start seeing that in fact you can't get that kind of reductive model, and now it's no longer mysterious. You've really got something great to latch onto and start asking, well, how do you get this from the ingredients?
But then you have that moment, but then you have to decide, oh God, is it ontological or epistemological emergence, right?
You do, and again, I understand, your audience is not necessarily oriented in this direction, but there are great examples of physics where it's really hard to explain away the ontological emergence. So the standard example is quantum entanglement, that the joint state of some interacting systems cannot be properly reduced to the states of the individual. What used to be the individual components. Right. There's a wonderful example that is discussed by Olivier Sartner and Alexandra Gué of the fractional quantum Hall effect. And what you get there is that you take a system that has three spatial dimensions and cut out the third spatial dimension, so it's operating in two dimensions. And what you find is that there is a law in the two-dimensional case that not only is not present in the three-dimensional case, but in fact couldn't be. It's prohibited by the three-dimensional model. That's really hard to explain away as epistemological emergence.
Oh, that's cool.
You can get those cases, but I certainly don't want to say that ontological emergence is an easy thing to really get. Yeah.
Well, so you keep mentioning the bent of my neuroscience-minded audience here. So there are a lot of subjects in philosophy that continue alongside experimental neuroscience, right? Things that are being tested in neuroscience, experimented, theoretical questions being asked, and philosophy runs right alongside those and continues to refine definitions and move concepts around. But there's no real, that I'm aware of, there's no real experimental science of emergence yet, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm right, do you see emergence becoming something that we can experimentally ask about, query?
Yeah, and in fact, in a slightly different sense, one of the really interesting developments in the last few years is the hope, and it's empirically grounded in some cases, that you can engineer emergence. I mean, philosophers have, and I think a lot of other people have said, well, emergence is a natural phenomenon, and you have to develop theories and observe it and so forth. But especially in biology, there's a growing sense that you can actually go there in the lab and not just experimentally mess around with natural systems, but engineer them.
Are you talking about conception and giving birth in the lab, Paul? Is that what you're getting at here?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's well.
It sounds like an ethics violation.
I'm not going anywhere near that joke.
Well, okay, yeah.
Are you sure that IRB approves those experiments?
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to that engineering aspect a little bit later. But before we move on, I want to know this is for Paul specifically, what's the most common question you get asked about emergence?
It's undoubtedly, is consciousness emergent?
And what do you say? Do you just roll your eyes and walk away, or what?
No, I don't roll my eyes and walk away. I give them the answer that I gave you, that I certainly don't know enough about neuroscience and cognitive psychology to say whether it is or it isn't. And no disrespect to the state of neuroscience, because it's astonishingly hard. I don't think that we're there yet. So that's my answer.
The vast majority of neuroscientists would agree with you, so we can all be friends. So speaking of consciousness, so I was doing a guided mindful meditation a couple weeks ago, actually, and this is a true story. So I was listening to someone guide me through a mindful meditation, and the guider, I suppose, emphasized, how contents of our consciousness, will appear and disappear. And during a mindful meditation, your goal is to just kind of notice these and kind of watch them, right? That's one of the goals anyway. And so I was sitting there and I had this thought come into my head. I don't remember what it was. It was probably, like, oh, you must edit a podcast or something like that. And then I kind of I could watch it disappear. And I thought, and then I came out of my mindfulness, of course, and I thought, oh, there really hasn't been much research that I know of on how thoughts extinguish, right? On what I'm about to say is the dynamic aspect of thinking. Now, Zach, you have studied the neuroscience and philosophy of spontaneous thought and of mind wandering, especially, and you've even defined mind wandering as unguided attention. And of course, I will link to a ton of your papers in the show notes here. But maybe let's switch to this idea of spontaneous thought and mind wandering, and what is it?
Sure, and we can get back to the mindfulness question afterwards once we have some conceptual resources on the board, on the table. So here's the idea. Say there's a student who is in class, and rather than pay attention to the lecture, her mind starts wandering. So it wanders from a camping trip that she's going to go on with her friends to a party that she just had last weekend, maybe to a test that she's going to take next week. And I think that what makes her thoughts wandering is that they sort of wander or meander from one topic to another. So I think that sort of dynamics of thought is really what defines mind wandering. And one of the nice things about that is it gives us clear contrast cases between mind wandering and other types of thought. So think about that same student, sits in class, still not paying attention to lecture, but she's deliberately working through a math proof. I think that's not mind wandering. And in fact, some of my recent work has done sort of experimental philosophy to use the sort of methods, vignette-based methods of experimental philosophy to to experimentally test what ordinary people think about mind wandering. And they also think that the sort of dynamics of thought, sort of where they're sort of wandering from one topic to another, is far more central to the sort of ordinary folk concept of mind wandering and to my philosophical account of mind wandering than sort of whether the student's paying attention to lecture or not.
But
right? It really depends on.
Yeah, so we can contrast this with what's been kind of thought of as the traditional definition of mind wandering, which is just so generally in neuroscience, we study task-related phenomenon, right? And so
Exactly, yeah.
people have been, thinking of mind wandering and spontaneous thought of just the opposite of that without really considering the dynamics of it, which you're saying are really is the quintessential aspect of it.
Yeah, and Felicity Callard had this really nice stuff on she did this sort of sociology of mind wandering research where she made this nice paper where she made an argument that this is sort of like a hangover of behaviorism, is that we had this cognitive revolution in the 50s, right, where we stopped talking about behavior and we started talking about inner mental processes. But what did we use to study inner mental processes? Well, we used tasks, right, and the same kind of sort of behavioral tasks that the behaviorists would use, right? And this was great for studying all sorts of aspects of the mind, but it assumes that everything the mind does is going to be task related. And so, and then what we did in neuroscience is said, okay, all right, so not everything that the mind, and sort of in the 2000s, people had this revolution with not everything the mind does is task related. Wow, isn't that weird? So everything that the mind doesn't do that's task related is the same then.
Right.
Which I think is a problematic assumption. And I think that there are deep differences between different kinds of ways your thoughts can unfold when you're not paying attention to a task. Your mind can sort of wander from one topic to another. You can just pursue another task or another goal and sort of direct your thoughts. You can also ruminate and fixate on the same topic over and over and over again. And I think the dynamics of those different types of thoughts are very different. And I've hypothesized, working with neuroscientists like Kalina Christoph, that the neural underpinnings of those different types of thoughts are very different as well.
Yeah, so you working with Kalina Christoph, whom you just mentioned,
yeah.
So you guys have a couple papers where there's this kind of scale, right, of categories of spontaneous thought, and it's along an axis of sort of deliberate constraints on those thoughts, right? And the least constrained within the category of spontaneous thought, the least constrained type of thought is dreaming, right, along this axis. And then a little bit more constrained is mind wandering, and then just above mind wandering in constraint is creative thinking, being the most constrained of these spontaneous thought categories. So we're going to kind of jump around here, but I can think of a function for dreaming, right? And sleep and the dreaming of, go ahead.
One thing first is there's also the axis of automatic constraints as well. So here's the sort of quick and dirty version of the neural hypothesis.
Good, yeah.
Let's say you're having a stream of memories, right? Or you're imagining some scenes. That's going to depend on the medial temporal subnetwork within the default network is going to be part of what's activating that sort of perceptual processing when you're sort of, say, imagining a scene and hearing some sounds that you might have on like a beach or something like that, and then in a classroom.
Let me just interject and just state that the default network is, when you're talking about this revolution, it's just a distributed set of brain areas that come online when you're not doing task-related activities. That's the sort of overall default network. And what's been discovered is that there's lots of different subnetworks of the default network, and some can come online within these different types of mental processes.
And it's also been discovered, though, that that was the sort of original picture of the default network.
Yeah.
But the default network is actually engaged in task-related thought too. Right. So, for example, Nathan Sprang's work suggests that you can sort of engage in autobiographical planning. So really goal-directed, focused planning that activates the default network. And one thing that might suggest is, it turns out this default network, which has been traditionally associated with mind wandering, right? So one thing Nathan's work could suggest is maybe mind wandering is goal-directed and focused, and there really isn't this difference between these different dynamics of thoughts. Or my interpretation, it might suggest that we need to look more at sort of how the default network's activity can be constrained by other networks. So in the case of affective thought, how sort of limbic systems and salience networks can sort of focus you on what's sort of affectively salient to you. Say when you're obsessing about a fight that you just had with your friend, right? And you're just thinking over and over and over again about that friend, that fight. Or in the case where you're engaged in goal-directed thought, say when you're solving an algebra problem, and sort of frontal parietal control networks can sort of focus you on what's relevant to the algebra problem, so you're sort of not paying attention to other things. Or in the case of mind wandering, where the default network is free from those sort of top-down constraints, and thus can sort of generate this associative stream of memories and imaginative experiences because these constraints are absent. I have more philosophically to say about what those constraints. I think that they're not just constraints, they're guidance, and so that's a more substantive theory than you find in the neuroscience about what that constraint amounts to. And I think that guidance is sort of absent in the case of mind wandering.
Great. Well, yeah. So, did you want to speak a little bit more about mind wandering in the brain, or one of the things that I like, and there's a common thread in this podcast, is just that dynamics, how important dynamics are. So the example of diachronic emergence, right? So that no one thinks of emergence as occurring over time, right? I don't know if we're just not equipped to think of things happening in time in that way, because no one was talking about mind wandering as a dynamic process. But it's such an obvious way to think about it once you understand it, right?
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why is because it was just like, it's a lot easier to interrupt someone and say, hey, was the last thought that you just had?
The slice.
Think about that thought, that individual thought. Was that thought related to the task that you were doing in the lab, right? That's a lot easier to ask than the kind of questions that my colleagues and I have asked. So like in Caitlin Mills has this really nice paper where we asked about were your thoughts sort of freely moving from one topic to another, right? And it turns out I think that you can learn a lot about the sort of stream of consciousness by asking those kind of questions. But those kind of questions are harder to ask to participants. And folks in psychology who are sort of wary of introspection, right? Because in mind wandering research, you have to ask subjects about their experiences. That's the sort of gold standard for how you classify thought. And there's been a sort of principled skepticism about introspection. So if you're asking about sort of really coarse-grained features of a single thought, like are you thinking about the experimental task? I think psychologists were less wary about that than if you're asking these more fine-grained features like are your thoughts freely moving from one topic to another? Are you sort of obsessively focused on a single thing? Are your thoughts directed to a single topic? And giving people instructions on how to answer those questions. I think that those, there's an open question as to whether people can, well, I don't think there's an open question. I think there's some empirical evidence that we've been gathering that people actually can answer those questions and sort of classify their thoughts in meaningful ways.
Yeah.
But I think those who are skeptical of introspection were more worried about those kind of questions, which is what led us from these sort of methods to the definitions that focus on the contents of thoughts, what's going on at a single time, because they're just easier to measure.
Yeah.
It's like the old analogy of like, why is a man looking for his keys under the lamp, right, or under a road light? Because there's light here. Right?
That's where the light is. Yeah.
That's where the light is. Butchered that joke, but
no, that's good. Oh, don't worry, I'll edit it. It'll sound great.
Hope we keep that in.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe we can bring it back to mindfulness a little bit, but because
sure.
So okay. First of all, let's go back to the scale, and then we'll move on to AI in just a couple minutes.
Yeah.
So just thinking about dreaming as being constraint free, and I'm just going to keep it on the one axis for now, and then mind wandering have a few more constraints, and then creative thinking a little bit more constrained, but still under the rubric of spontaneous thought, which I really like that classification.
Mm-hmm.
Where does mindful meditation fit within this guided versus unguided attention versus spontaneous thought, goal-directed thought scale? Where does that fit in?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's one that I've been working with Sonam Khatru on. We have a project on harnessing the wandering mind, where we're looking at ways of sort of that people have directed things like mind wandering in sort of Buddhist traditions. One thing to understand about these traditions is there's a lot of different types of Buddhists, and there's a lot of different types of meditation, right? This is like asking sort of how does a Western philosopher characterize
emergence,
consciousness?
Yeah.
How does a Western philosopher characterize beliefs or any of the things that we talk about? There's a lot of debate, right? And I think what you find is that there are certain types of attention practices, like sort of focused attention practices, that mindfulness practices that look very different than mind wandering. So think about the practice of paying attention to your breath as it's exiting your nose, right? And where what you're doing is just, the goal is to keep your attention focused on that specific content of that specific experience. That, I think, looks very different than mind wandering.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But think about other practices where, Sonam has suggested, and this is part of our research, that you're going to find these practices a lot more in Zen meditation in China and Japan than in the sort of more rationalist meditation practices that you find in India and Tibet. But there are other practices where, or this is the thing that we're trying to argue, is where what you're doing is just letting your thoughts wander and watching them. And then what you're doing, insofar as you're exerting control over your thoughts, what you're doing is stopping your mind from getting focused on anything in particular.
Okay.
I think that's really cool. That's a really cool category of thought from the perspective of the mental action.
So that's like a constraint on not having constraints, sort of, right?
Exactly. It's a sort of like active passivity. Yeah. What you're doing is making sure that you're actively initiating and maintaining a state where your thoughts are passively unfolding from one topic to another, where you're not exerting any control over the first order contents of your thought. I think that's a perfectly coherent, and I think that's what might be going on. There are lots of, so Paul Selly has this great research program that started with Giambria, but he really developed it on intentional mind wandering. So this is when people report that my mind wandered on purpose. So you ask a student in the classroom, did you just find that your mind was wandering, or did you intentionally let your mind wander? And students will often report that they intentionally let their mind wander. And in fact, when you look at the English, so when you look at how people speak about mind wandering, the most common thing that we say, the most common colloquiet for mind wandering is let. Like, I let my mind wander.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's this pervasive evidence that this is the thing that people can do. They can intentionally mind wander. And I think that but that's really weird, right? Like, how can you intentionally do this passive thing? That's a big puzzle that philosophers should engage in. And in fact, there have been philosophers, Sam Murray and Christina Krasic, have actually argued that it's impossible. Intentional mind wandering, yeah, people say they do it, but it's logically impossible that people are doing the thing that they're doing. I think it is possible. And I think that that's because what people are doing is they're intentionally initiating and maintaining this sort of unguided mode of thought. And I think that kind of intentional maintenance of an unguided mode of thought is actually much better theorized in Buddhist traditions, especially in China and Japan, than it has been in the West. It's just very foreign. Well, has been in Western psychology. If you look at sort of like Western creative individuals who talk about their own thought processes, then this kind of thought gets theorized a lot, right? Melba Katakin, who's in English, has talked about about writers who talk about maintaining this sort of passive mode of thinking, where you just like let ideas come to you.
Let
right?
them use.
This is something that people have learned how to do. It's a super interesting human capacity and a type of human mental action that's just completely untheorized in philosophy and in cognitive science. It's under theorized cognitive science.
And in neuroscience as well. Yeah. That's the beautiful thing is there's just so much to do. The more we answer, of course, the more questions there are, which is beautiful in some sense and extremely frustrating in some other sense, But so, okay, just to bring it back to mind wandering before we move on. So what, on that scale I was talking about with dreaming, I can think of a function for dreaming. There's an obvious function for creative thinking because you're going to, an emergent thought will come and then you'll make your next best product. But what might be the function of mind wandering?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned creative thinking. And I think one of the functions for mind wandering might be to sort of facilitate creativity. And there's some empirical evidence for that. I'm hoping that we'll get better empirical evidence for that if we look at the sort of distinguish the different subtypes of task-related thought. So one of the functions for mind wandering might be to facilitate creativity. So here's how that would work on my sort of model. Let's say you're sort of like engaged in goal-directed thought about a problem. That's great that you can do that. It's really important because it allows humans to focus on the things that we really want to focus on and work through them.
And keep their job.
Yeah, keep their job, exactly. One problem with doing that is when you focus on some goal-directed topic, you have to have a task set. So that's sort of some understanding of what's relevant to the problem and what isn't. And that's great too, because when you sort of focus on, how to edit your podcast, you don't want to have the thought pop into your mind that, oh, maybe I should just inject a bunch of metal in the middle. And then so that's why whenever Paul talks, there's going to be sort of, metal going on. And when Zach talks, there's going to be Bach or something. Don't think about hopefully that idea doesn't just spontaneously pop into your mind, because that would be a very bad way to edit your podcast. That shouldn't be in the task set. Well, I guess we'll see.
We'll see.
And so it's good that you can sort of limit yourself to the relevant topics. You focus your attention. But there's also cost to that, which is that you can be wrong. So you can think that what's relevant to solving a problem is X, and it might turn out that there's some sort of creative insight that you've missed. And the right way to think about maybe you focus when you're focusing on mind wandering, maybe you exclusively think about mind wandering as task unrelated thought. And because you're sort of focused on that conception of the scientific phenomenon, you completely miss the dynamics, right? And you ignore it. And I think a lot of cases of creative insights are precisely when we just think about a problem in a new way. And I think mind wandering allows us to do that because it's not guided to a topic, and thus the sort of task set is exerting less control over what you're thinking, how you are thinking about each topic that you're thinking about. I think it allows you to have these sort of creative insights, which is why, for example, that people with ADHD whose minds wander a lot more in this sort of strict sense, so they're meandering from topic to topic, why those folks tend to be more creative than their intelligence-matched peers, even though they have lots of difficulties, right? I mean, I'm definitely on the spectrum for that, right? And it causes lots of problems, but it also helps me, I think, come up with the creative ideas that I do. And that there's other evidence that mind wandering can sort of facilitate creativity. And I think that's partly why, is because it allows us to think about seemingly irrelevant stuff.
It may be a good hypothesis for why when people get stuck on problems that are very goal-directed issues, if you just put your work down and go for a walk outside, right? This just generates some spontaneous mind wandering. And all of a sudden you find the solution.
Yeah, exactly. And think of there's two very different explanations for that effect, right? This is called the incubation effect. Mm-hmm. So why is it helpful to sort of go and do something else, right? To take a shower, wash some dishes, go for a walk. Why does that sort of help us solve problems? One explanation for that is just it gives you time to think about the problem more. But the problem with that is, well, then why don't you just keep sitting down? Another explanation for it is just you stop thinking about the problem. And so you just do something completely different. Your mind isn't occupied with this at all. And then when you come back to it, there's this sort of unconscious processes might be better at solving creative problems. I think one worry about that is, well, often when I go take a shower and I'm working on a paper, I still keep thinking about the paper, right? And often, this phenomenologically, it seems like in a lot of these cases, what happens is we do keep thinking about the problem. But that leads to a third hypothesis about why, which is a hypothesis that I think happens sometimes, is we think about the problem in a different way. The dynamics are unguided. We'll maybe think about the problem for a second and think about something else. We maybe think in weird ways about the problem that we haven't before. And I think there's this sort of mode of conscious thought, or sort of the mode of the stream of thought, sort of mind wandering, that actually has a function in allowing us to sort of think about problems in new ways. And that's my hypothesis.
Yeah, very good. So there's a lot more we could talk about, obviously, and I'll leave it to the listeners really, because there are a lot of clinical implications. You mentioned ADHD, but just for the rate of wandering from topic to topic, and just the interactions of different types of systems and their individual dynamic rates. So, but for the interest of time today, let's wander into the topic of AI. So emergence and mind wandering have something in common in that you don't hear them often mentioned in the same breath as artificial intelligence. So let's make that happen here. You don't often hear it anyway. Of course, I could be wrong. So we're going to hop around and touch on AI with both of these topics a little bit. So I keep dropping names too, So I interviewed Ryota Kanai, whose goal is to study the functions of consciousness and then build it into artificial intelligent systems, right? So let's say, Paul, emergence is an important phenomenon to establish consciousness, that it's always associated with consciousness or gives rise to consciousness, and or general artificial intelligence, for instance. And we touched on this earlier. Do you think that it's a worthwhile endeavor to try to manifest emergence in an AI system? And if so, how would one go about doing that? And we can ask the same about mind wandering in a second.
Yeah, okay. So let me take that question in a slightly different direction than I think you probably want it to go in. To me, in artificial intelligence, it's the artificial part that is really important. So the research projects, which are, of course, perfectly respectable and neural-inspired architectures have given us a lot of interesting insights. But those projects that model artificial intelligence on human intelligence are only part of how you can investigate artificial intelligence. And there's no obvious reason why one should try to create consciousness, especially if you're working with a computational theory of the mind, right? I mean, consciousness plausibly could just be a biological process, in which case, unless you've got biological computing, you're probably not going to get it out of neural nets in the artificial realm. Mm-hmm. So that's just one thing I wanted to throw out there, because I find, think about other areas. I mean, if people who were in the early days of investigating flight had tried to model it on birds, as some of them did, they failed spectacularly. You have to think that there are other ways of doing this, and it's often going to be that you're more successful. Yeah. Locomotives are not literally iron horses. They do it better than horses do.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, everyone I ask about this, about how to create AGI, is there a way besides, just modeling everything after what we know about humans, human intelligence, and almost to a T, there are exceptions like last week, but they say, well, humans are the only example that we know of that have this property that we want to create, right? Mm-hmm. And actually, an exception was Sam Gershman, whom I had on last week, and he, with some other people, wrote this paper about how if we want machines to think like humans, the current state of AI and deep learning is missing a bunch of features like intuitive physics and intuitive psychology and causality, for instance. So there's this push to build these human processes into deep learning and AI systems. And so, but how might an AI agent benefit from something like mind wandering, for instance?
Well, yeah, I mean, you again, I would want to argue for not thinking in those terms. I mean, there are, of course, analogous processes in artificial intelligence. I mean, so stochastic gradient descent, simulated annealing and so forth. Right. I mean, they're introducing noise into the system in order to stop you getting in a seriously suboptimal state. So they're analogous, but, why do we need a mind, right? We already know that deep neural nets are way better than us at playing chess and Go. Right. No way we're going to catch up with that. In other ways, they're seriously inferior, and humans have better capacities in those realms. But, let's pursue both research traditions, and it looks plausible that you'll come out ahead by forgetting about clearly psychological features, and in other ways you won't.
It depends on whether you want to build machines to do cool stuff or whether you want to build machines to model the mind.
Sure. Not just model the mind, but figure out the mind, right? Learn what the mind is.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And those are two very different research programs. Like, does an algorithm that relies on having vastly more computations than humans could ever have, is that going to tell us about how human mind works? I don't know.
And they're both legitimate research programs.
Right.
But, I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but I don't find humans very interesting. Right?
Well, it's been nice talking to you guys, and we will...
Yeah, and if my wife is going to listen to this, I'm in real trouble. But you see what I mean, right? That There are many ways of investigating the world in which humans are actually a handicap.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to think much more broadly than focusing the idea on a single example of intelligence, which is clearly seriously suboptimal.
Well, I mean, so if you're going to focus on here's an advantage that humans have over AI. We were designed by evolution, and evolution comes up with really clever solutions.
And it's had millions of years to do it.
And it's had millions of years to do it, and it comes up with really clever solutions that human engineers just don't come up with.
Mm-hmm.
One example of this that I talk about in my philosophy of neuroscience class is how the hand is processed. So in the brain, so like how hand movements are processed. So you'd think, like, if a human engineer was designing it, you'd have one little bit that processes the thumb and then the finger and then all of each digit, and then you combine them together into this meta process. But that's just not how the brain does it. What the brain processes is gross motor movements like this, right? Because those were evolutionarily more important. And then
he just chopped Paul in the neck for the listeners.
Oh yeah, that's right. Now it's a philosophical battle.
I'm not denying that evolution leads to some very interesting processes, but think about the role that machine learning plays in high energy physics these days. The Large Hadron Collider could not do anything because of the quantity of data that it's got without, if you allow the machine learning is part of artificial intelligence. I mean, humans are just completely out of the picture there until, you've got some event that looks interesting. So, all I'm trying to urge is that we should not think of humans as the only part of the solution space in these areas.
Right.
There's a huge set of alternative possibilities which we're only just beginning to understand. And of course, this leads into an area which is, because the thing that a lot of people are really interested in, and that is the ethics of this, right? So if you're a rationalist about ethics, right, so you're roughly a Kantian in this, I mean, in areas where artificial intelligence is actually better than we are, why not look to that for superior ethical solutions? Restricting yourself to humans where we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are ethically seriously deficient is not a good place to be.
I mean, I don't see why this is more getting into sort of applications of AI. I think better approaches would be to feed human inputs into a machine learning system. So, like Walter Sinnott Armstrong's work on organ choice. So how to choose who to give an organ to. So what he does is he has general theories that are fed into an AI algorithm, in addition to folk psychological judgments on particular cases that you get by just looking at enter. And you feed that into a machine learning algorithm, so it tries to abstract the sort of general rules that would most fairly apply those human judgments. And this is also how I like to think about, using machine learning to classify neural states as well. I think that on the one hand, you want to use these great techniques, but on the other hand, I'm a pluralist about methodology, where I think that machine learning is going to have some deficits that sort of you have to feed data into the machine learning algorithm. And so if you're not using your sort of best theories of a phenomenon to sort of feed the data that of organ choice, right? If you're not
But I don't. I mean, I said before, of course, I'm a pluralist about this too, and it depends. If you have access to extremely large data sets, right? You're in one situation, and if you're in some areas of the social sciences where it's difficult, really expensive to get data sets like that, you're restricted to small data sets. You've got to use different methods. What I was urging simply is that, we should stop thinking that humans are somehow the epitome of excellence in certain areas, because it's demonstrable. Look how many areas that humans have screwed up in ordinary life. I would in some cases prefer to go with AI than with humans.
Yeah, so I know one of your interests, Paul, is computational science, and you wrote a book called Extending Ourselves, and it's in large part about how, with modern technology and things like AI, we can reach beyond what we can epistemologically, for instance, or just grasp as humans. And so we have this scenario, this potential scenario, like you're discussing with the Large Hadron Collider and other things, where we could potentially use AI to compute things, get an answer, not understand how we got the answer, but then potentially put our trust in it, right? In the answer, because we know it's better than we are at this certain type of task, right?
That is, as you know, currently a central problem in what's called explainable artificial intelligence. That deep neural nets are to a large extent opaque. We know at the algorithmic level how they work, but we don't know in sufficient details, what activation levels are representing what. And I entirely agree with you that is potentially a dangerous situation to be in.
If you look at
we don't know how humans do things.
But the antidote to that black box problem is that we do have access to all of the units in a deep neural net. Now, we might need to use a different neural net to analyze the first neural net, right, to get to understand it. But we do have at least access to all of the quote-unquote neurons, the neural units in the net.
Yeah, we do. And I think to a certain extent, it is true that when you build something, you've got better access to it. But I was persuaded that can't be generally true by my colleague Worthy Martin, when he pointed out that the Wright brothers really had almost no idea about how aeronautics worked, right. and yet they were successful. So having built the flyer.
But a central goal of science is explanation, right? And insofar as we're going to use AI to do science, where we're trying to understand the world, then the goal, I think that if you don't have explainable AI, right, where it's not going to give you explanations, then it's limited as a scientific tool.
That seems to me, an anthropocentric mistake. I mean, it's, we want that kind of understanding from the kind of science we've done in the last 400 years or so. But that doesn't mean that the only way to conduct science is by firmly, nailing it down to what humans can do.
Sure,
I mean, the Human Genome Project would never have been completed as fast as it was if it wasn't for automated genome sequencing. Right? We sort of understand that, but now you've got the sequence. Now humans can go in and start trying to understand.
So I can talk back to it's actually my first, as a weird side note. The first paper I ever published was on Paul's book. Paul's earlier work on this topic, and what I really liked there. So what I talked about was the use of, and what Paul's also talked about is the use of visualizations in computer simulations. So one of the sort of revolutions that led to computers being able to do the kind of role they have in science is that we can visualize very, very large data sets in ways that allow us to detect computationally and epistemically emergent phenomenon that we couldn't detect without those simulations. But to see why I think that's a really important scientific development, it's because it allows humans to understand and explain phenomena in the world in a way that they wouldn't be able to before. And that understanding and explanation those have a cognitive component to them. And so I do think it's anthropocentric, that this understanding of science. But I mean, I think that science is anthropocentric. It's the things that human beings do to understand.
We have a very fundamental disagreement there. The only way to work this out is to hang around for a couple of hundred years and see where we are. You see, when I first published that book, I got a lot of sneers from philosophers. They thought, this is just number crunching. It's epistemologically completely important. Things have changed a bit then. And you look at the history of computer-assisted mathematics. I mean, there was enormous resistance to that by mathematicians for perfectly understandable reasons. I mean, along the lines that Zach has mentioned. But the mathematics community has come to accommodate it to a certain extent. And it is a matter of, how far do you want this to extend into the traditional subject and how far you don't. That's a matter for technological determinism and all kinds of other things. But let's not be Luddites about this kind of thing and think we're,
Speaking of Luddites, in that book, and we're going to move on to some general questions here because we're running short on time, but that's an excellent book, Extending Ourselves. One of my favorite parts in the book, though, is when there's this footnote. You mentioned Legos as an example, and then there's a footnote where you have to define what a Lego is. Legos are little plastic. Like, what? I guess in evolutionary timescales that might be relevant, but I think everyone knows what a Lego is, right?
No, I didn't. I'm sorry, your readers can't see me. I was born a long time ago, and there weren't Legos around then, believe it or not. So, maybe I was talking to the wrong crowd, but. But you're right. Everybody now knows what Legos are.
In the updated version, you could remove the footnote, although it was one of my favorite parts. So,
that's alarming.
That's alarming. So let's just get into some broader questions here. And these are for both of you, all of these questions. So how do you guys view the role of philosophy with respect to neuroscience and or artificial intelligence? What's the role of philosophy here?
Why don't you do the neuroscience?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have this sort of ordinary understanding of mental phenomena, like mind wandering and like attention and like memory, that sometimes contain really important, that philosophers are really good at analyzing these sort of ordinary concepts. And sometimes I think that there are cases, like in my field, where finding this sort of ordinary way of understanding mind wandering that links it to its dynamics can actually lead to a great deal of scientific progress. Because so one way you get these like very different poles of how philosophers have approached psychology, where you get sort of one pole where philosophers say, we really don't need to pay attention to what the scientists are doing, right? You get another pole that says we just need to read our concepts off of scientists. So if I'm trying to do philosophy of mind and understand what attention is, understand what mind wandering is, this is actually what my advisor, I'll tell him right now, this is what my advisor, Evan Thompson, told me to do originally in my dissertation, is just, mind wandering is a scientific concept, so look at how the scientists define it, and that's going to be the right way of understanding it.
Interesting.
And I think that there's an approach in the middle which tries to engage with science, and you want to formulate hypotheses that are testable by empirical researchers. Maybe you want to work with empirical researchers to test those hypotheses. But you don't take the way that scientists have understood a phenomenon as a given. And you use sources of evidence like how a concept has been conceived of historically by philosophers, right? Like mind wandering. I think Hobbes has the right view of mind wandering, had hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You take evidence like how a phenomenon is conceived of in literature, right? Like I think Virginia Woolf has like a really innovative and interesting picture of mind wandering in other cultures and sort of Buddhist philosophy. And just when you're sort of analyzing ordinary cases for yourselves, you take that sort of evidence for a phenomenon really seriously, because it can lead you to discover different ways of thinking about the mind that, as a historical contingent fact, psychologists and neuroscientists of the present day have ignored. You take I have some research taking where trying to, I think a really cool new trend in philosophy is to try and take folk psychological use the methods of experimental philosophy, which gets at folk psychological understanding of philosophical concepts like responsibility and freedom and causation. Use those same sort of methods to get at ordinary people's understanding of psychological concepts like mind wandering or control or attention. And I think that those kind of methods where you're getting at these sort of ordinary understanding of a mental phenomenon can really inform the science. Sometimes they'll be wrong. Sometimes we have this sort of ordinary understanding of the phenomenon that's just bunk. And sometimes we'll be right. We'll be right. And so I think it's an independent source of evidence that philosophers are particularly well positioned to extract that can inform ongoing empirical debates, and in fact is in my field.
And Paul, do you think? What do you think about AI?
AI is a bit different because the research traditions have changed. So as people I'm sure know, with traditional rule-based AI. I mean, that came out of philosophy and logic. Right? So you've got Russell and Whitehead, and then you've got those great people, Gödel and Turing and so forth, who developed the theory of computation. And then, you've got Turing's famous paper about, that gave us the Turing test and so forth. And that's one place where there's a clear and solid connection between that tradition and philosophy. Things are really difficult, much harder with neural net stuff, because, partly for practical reasons, it's developing so fast that I don't know even how people in the area keep up with that. And it's divorced from the logic tradition, and so the way that philosophers are trained, you need statistics and machine learning and so forth to understand that. And just because of the way that we're situated in the humanities, it's not likely that a lot of philosophers would have the background to do that. So I actually don't know what's going to happen with that. But in terms of problems that philosophers can help with, I mean, the ethical issues are going to be really, really important.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to somehow grab Silicon Valley by the scruff of the neck and shake them and say, listen, just pay attention to some of these things, because socially they're of vital importance. So, and that doesn't mean, the doomsday people like Elon Musk and so forth, we're all going to be killed by robots. It's much more, the effect of invasion of privacy on democracy and all those things that are coming into public view, are things that philosophers have really got to pay attention to and are starting to do so.
But damn it, man, those are hard things to think about.
They are.
Yeah.
And one thing that is really hard to think about, but I think is fascinating, is could there be a specific machine ethics? So people are interested in, programming autonomous vehicles so that, they won't mow you down when you're crossing the road. and that's fine, and that's really important. But suppose that you do get these artificial agents who, in some areas, are much better, smarter than doing this. Could you get a specifically machine ethics that is appropriate to that? And if you do, how are you going to tether it to human interests and human ethics? It could be different, and you want it not to become too autonomous. So there's a question which is, on a PhD dissertation topic that's really hard, but really important and really interesting. If I was going back to graduate school, I might do that.
Boy, yeah, you'd be setting yourself up for a difficult path. Sam Gershman last episode said, I asked him what his advice would be to someone starting out, and he said, well, you have to go basically swim against the current, and it might take a long time, but this is the way to do it. So that would be one very difficult project.
It is, because just to add one thing, I mean, the center of research is now shifting back to industry. I mean, back in the days of Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, a lot of really important stuff done there. And then for various reasons, which are also interesting, universities became, almost the only source of research. But now, there's dual bases here, but they're different. And so academic research is not the only place to be.
What do you guys think about, from a philosopher's perspective, let's say, and Zach, I know that you've done neuroscience as well, but right now I'm going to pin you as a philosopher. And from your perspective, what is the relationship like between philosophy and like the world of science and experimental science and stuff? Is it, I know we're all on the same team, but do you feel antagonism? Do you feel symbiotic relationship, or what?
Yeah, and I think it depends on the neuroscientist. So I think when you said, but damn it, it's really hard, I think that gets at something that's really, it's really, really deep, actually, about the sort of sociology of these sort of interdisciplinary studies. Like the first time I presented my view to a psych lab, and I was like, oh, so here's the standard view of, I won't say what psych lab it was, but I presented it to the psych lab, and I said, here's the standard view of mine. Wondering, here's all these counterexamples that show that the view isn't right, and so we need this new counterexample. How is swearing on your show?
Not encouraged, not declined. I mean, I feel free. No constraints. Very little mind wander, no constraints. Yeah.
Okay, you can get that. So I said what these problems with the standard view of mind wandering, what my view was, and one of the postdocs in the lab, their response was verbatim, "That's horse shit," and then to leave the room.
That's it.
so that you get that response sometimes, right?
Sure.
And I think the reason why you get that response is you're going in and telling people, hey, the way that you've been thinking about a phenomenon is problematic for all of these armchair reasons that I haven't done any work in the lab, which I have since, but at that point, I haven't done any work in the lab. I've been sitting in a chair, and I'm telling you that something in your research is wrong, right? Yeah, and in fact, I'm telling you that the way, if you're going to do it right, that you need to do it is like way harder and might not even be tractable. So when you say that sort of thing, yeah, there's some antagonism that can be the natural response to that sort of critique, conceptual critique of the literature. And I think one way to maybe thing that I've done since then to maybe make this a little bit easier is I have thought more specifically about how I would implement these sorts of conceptual critiques in an experiment. And I've actually worked with neuroscientists to do the experimentation. So I think one way to sort of reduce the antagonism is not to just do some philosophy and then say neener, but like do some philosophy and come up with these new ideas and then work with scientists about how to test them and be open to that sort of interdisciplinary work. I think once you do that, I think scientists tend to take you more seriously because they know that you know what you're doing in the lab.
It does. It takes a kind of a thick skin too. I mean, you guys, I'll share this with you, but only about 10% of the podcasts that I record actually make it to air because usually what happens is I start asking them questions and they say that's horse shit, and then they hang up. So.
Right. And I think part of the reason also is sociological. So like when I teach my classes, right, there's always, because I try to have classes that are catering to neuroscience and cognitive science students. And I think there's like about like the third or fourth week in, there will be someone that comes up to me and says, what are we doing? Like, this is all so confused and terrible. And like, this is all, so that has that sort of neuroscientist response. And then 2 weeks later, I have without fail, the student who has said that has come back and said, I really like this. This is great. Right.
Yeah.
And there has to be like, I think we all sort of feel like, oh, we're good at analyzing concepts. We can understand what we're talking about because we're smart. Right. And well, philosophers have trained for a decade at least, or much longer to do that well. And I think it's a sort of, can be a hard thing to sociologically to sort of, defer to someone on conceptual analysis. When you're a smart person and you work in a field, why should I listen to somebody just because they've thought a lot?
If you don't mind, let me say something there, because this topic is really important to me. So I used to do philosophy of physics, and it, as Zach said, some physicists who are interested in philosophical issues, and most of them are not, because they've got their work to do, and that's fine. But what we've seen in the last decade or so is some really seriously ignorant attacks on philosophy of science. So let's name some names here. It's Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson, some of the prominent features. Here's what I would say to your audience. I mean, by all means, criticize what philosophers are doing, and I personally welcome that. But please do it from an informed base. I mean, go and read some serious philosophy before you start laying into ideas that, with all due respect to those two people I mentioned, they clearly do not understand.
And the background was that they reinvented logical positivism. Which is I think one of the, if there's a consensus about anything in philosophy, because there's very few consensus, one of the consensus is that people tried that theory and it failed. It was actually perhaps the most miserable failure of the 20th century philosophy.
Yeah,
At least it was up there. And then they reinvented that theory and said, hey, this is the right theory, where we know that it's wrong.
Right. So, I mean, we would not, I hope, walk into a research seminar in neuroscience or AI and say, this is just wrong, and give some hopelessly elementary alternative that everybody in the room knows doesn't work.
Right.
But that's what these guys are doing here. And
that's the problem, is to state something with such definitiveness, right?
But also from a position, we don't expect, people who are not professional philosophers to know as much about philosophy as we do. But there's got to be some kind of constructive engagement here, because I'm sure that many of the things that philosophers do really will, in retrospect, look very naive and wrong and so forth. But I wanted to get that out there for your audience, because it's not a good way to proceed. And I think that, AI and philosophy and neuroscience and philosophy can really have some important constructive engagements.
And what I would say in terms of practical advice for how to sort of do that sort of interdisciplinary work is that a lot of the difficulty is just a translation exercise, in terms of there are different disciplines that speak different languages that have different areas of expertise. Mm-hmm. And so the burden on you if you want to engage with philosophy, or the burden on me if I want to engage with science, is not to become the burden on a neuroscientist is not to become as good of a philosopher as a philosopher. That's a totally unreasonable expectation. And there's two people, maybe I could think of 3 or 4 people who have done that in the world. And what I would say the burden on you is to learn how to speak enough of the language so that you can ask the experts what their views are.
Jargon is a huge barrier here.
Yeah.
But often one doesn't realize it on either side until you got pretty far into the disagreement.
But it's doable, though. Just immerse yourself in like for a philosopher, right? If you have philosophy audiences who want to learn how to do this, go to a psych lab. That's my advice to philosophy psychology students. Sit in a psych lab for a couple of years and just listen to them and talk with them, and you'll learn how to speak the language. And the same thing is if you want to learn how to do philosophy as a neuroscientist, go to a philosophy reading group, hang out with philosophers, and you'll learn how to speak the language.
Yeah, this is a kind of recurring theme now on the show. And like John Krakauer talked about the importance of just going to the library one day, right? And browsing and stuff. But the constant friction with that is that nobody has time, to become, you say immerse yourself, and that's brilliant on paper, right? But I hardly have time to raise my kids when I was doing postdoctoral neuroscience research, right? Because your resources, there's just so much demand on your resources. So anyway, I got rid of my kids, and that helped that. But I mean, it really is. It's a constant battle of what to focus on, and social media is not the answer. So maybe that's the time that you're on Twitter and Facebook, you should go and learn stuff. But something like philosophy, to really learn it, it's a real tall hill to climb. And that has to be the case for every domain, really, these days. We can't be Renaissance men. Like you said, 2 or 3 people that you know of that can spread themselves out in a way that's functional, essentially.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In fact, I really don't have an answer to that, because, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, even within the field of AI, it's extraordinarily difficult for people to just keep up with what's going on. But you see, if different parts of academia or research out there in the technical world become siloed in the way that it's likely to do if people don't talk to each other, there are straightforwardly bad consequences of this. I mean, just think about what happened when Mark Zuckerberg testified in front of Congress. It was so clear that almost nobody in that room even understood the basics of what Zuckerberg was doing. And that's detrimental to, in that case, not just to democracy, but in trying to seriously assess where it might be good for society to try and steer some of these projects, both in neuroscience, I think, and in and in AI.
I don't know if so. I mean, there are things that can be done about the time commitment, right? And things can be said about that. So one of the things is like it's just on the burden of institutions. So, like for example, it takes a lot of time to co-teach a class between two different disciplines, right? So I think something that universities should do is provide course relief for the non-co-taught classes.
Mm-hmm.
So that you just teach less if you co-teach a class. That one class counts for two. Provide, like Templeton has this really great, there are criticisms of Templeton, but one of the lovely things that they have is a sort of mid-career money to get course release for a whole year, so that you go and as a philosopher learn how to do a scientific field. And I have friends that are like learn, just sit and do neuroscience for a year and learn all the stats. Right? You don't publish. You don't have to publish for a year. You don't have to, but you just learn something, and then your future research is going to be better. So it's just deferred, like it's delay of gratification, right? You just don't eat all the cookies right now, and invest in a cookie making machine, and then you can make better cookies in a year, and then they will be more delicious and consumed with greater citations in.
But this is a really important question, because it's what universities are struggling with now. I mean, a lot of emphasis on STEM fields. I mean, what are the liberal arts going to do? And I would, even though of course, I'm in the humanities, it would be a disaster if the humanities disappeared from universities because they were underfunded or students didn't want to take them. And I say that with, I love STEM fields. I think, they're just great, but they're not everything. And so, the question you're asking, how do these two areas fit together, is something it's too bad we haven't got more time to discuss it.
Yeah, I was just, to toss a business idea out there. Maybe we can develop some AI systems to make translation between fields super efficient, right? So that
I have a great AI system a great system to do that. Just be friends with people in other fields and talk with them over dinner and beer, and maybe even write papers with them. That's the most efficient way to do it.
And the beer is important.
The beer is important, yeah. But we have a well-established and very effective method for drawing these kind of interdisciplinary connections, which is just friendship. And that's what I would recommend to someone who's trying to draw these interdisciplinary links is find people in another discipline that you can talk to, and then just talk to them.
So guys, let me ask you one more question, then I'll let you go here. So my background is in experimental science, and as a scientist, I'm never wrong. Are philosophers ever wrong? My real question is there an idea that stands out in your mind that you've had in the past that you've just gotten wrong, or a time that you've really failed? And if so, how did you overcome it and move on?
Well, this is going to sound awful, but I don't think I actually got anything that was important wrong. I've certainly written more than my fair share of papers are just boring and trivial and irrelevant. But I do spend a long time on papers and books that I really want to get right. And of course, as soon as this goes out to the world, there'll be philosophers who think, whoa, is that guy unself-conscious about his own work? But
easy answer, Paul, is just coming on this podcast. But I'll let you say you've got nothing wrong.
Thank you. But no, it sounds horribly self-serving, but I can't think of about Zach. Zach's too young to be wrong.
No, maybe you're too old, such that your memory is not good enough that you can't remember being wrong, right?
No, I mean it might be. People keep trying to persuade me that it's all wrong.
So I think that there's a sort of, I'm going to sidestep the question in a very philosophy way. So I think that there's different ways of dealing with being wrong in academic work. So when you are wrong about something, and I think that this is part of the reason why I think philosophy can be so frustrating for non-philosophers, is that sometimes being wrong about like a case or something like that, or about a detail, what that pushes you to do is revise the view a little bit. And that's a process that we jokingly, I don't know if this term is actually insulting or not, which the philosophers refer to as chiselming, because Roderick Chisholm did this a lot in his papers. He would come up with counterexamples and then revise his definition a little bit, and then come up with another counterexample and revise his definition a little bit.
So that's called moving the goalposts in common parlance.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right, but I don't think it's moving the goalpost. I think it's getting closer to the truth. Is that sometimes philosophy works best in this sort of what one term for is reflective equilibrium, where you start off with a theory and then you think about edge cases that don't work in that theory, and you either sort of explain the edge cases away or revise your model a little bit. And some of the things that I think I'm most right about now have come from just someone gives a counterexample and I think, oh no, I'm just completely wrong. So intentional mind wandering is a good one, right? When I first read about this stuff from Paul Selly, when it was still in his dissertation, I read it and was like, oh, well, guess I'm wrong. And then I realized, no, actually, I think these two things are compatible. Paul's talking about something that's orthogonal to what I'm talking about. And I think some of the best stuff that I'm doing right now has come from realizing that limitation of my earlier framework and changing the framework. So it might look like I'm moving the goalpost, but I don't think it is. I think it's just like getting closer to what I think is the truth about the phenomenon.
And I want to add something to what Zach said. I think philosophers in general are not good at admitting that they're wrong. And I've certainly been guilty of this.
Just philosophers? Yeah.
Myself. Because one of the great things about, science and mathematics is that by and large, it's pretty clear when, your hypothesis or proof or whatever is wrong. It's not so obvious in philosophy. And now I'm at a fairly advanced stage in my career. I'm really good at spotting advanced philosophers who come and give talks and get a question that is clearly something that they can't deal with or shows that their view is wrong, and start engaging in professional maneuvers to avoid having to say that. And it's a terrible, terrible intellectual trait. And I wish
skill.
Skill. No, it's not good. In the same way that if you're teaching a class and a student, as they do here, point out that that can't be right, you've got to say, oh yeah, what I just said is wrong, because you're conveying an awful message to
and yet both of us just said that we've never been wrong.
Yeah, not on something important. I know.
Well, Paul's suggesting that if you ever are wrong, you might be willing to admit it, I suppose.
I hereby invite anybody who's listening to this podcast to send me some reasons why something I've said is wrong, and I will listen to them. I mean, seriously. Yeah.
All right, so let me just write a note here in my diary, dear diary. Philosophers, still slippery sons of bitches. Yeah. No. Guys,
not all of them. Not all of them.
Hey, I really enjoyed this time. I wish we had more because we could go on and on, I know. But I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks.
And wish you both continued success with your work.
This has been really great.
Yeah, this
really
is great.
Nice.
Yeah,
really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Brain Inspired is a production of me. You can support the show through Patreon for a trifling $2 or $4 per month. Go to patreon.com/braininspired or go to the website braininspired.co and find the red Patreon button there. Your contribution will help keep this show going without any annoying advertisements like you hear on other shows. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. The music you hear is by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.
The stare